I think that sometimes in mainstream media, objectivity is prioritized over building trust with your reader base. And the reason I say that is because I think when you're overly, quote unquote, objective about the climate crisis, which translates, I think, in a lot of reporters and editors' minds to emotionless, to
two sides singing.
I don't care about what happens to the planet, then readers feel gaslit about what's happening. They feel like they can't trust you because you are not, as a storyteller, as a reporter, you don't actually care about whether or not their world gets screwed or not.
Welcome to the Pixabay Newscast. I'm your co-host, Mike DiGirolamo.
And I'm your co-host, Rachel Donald.
Bringing you weekly conversations with experts, authors, scientists, and activists, working on the front lines of conservation, shining a light on some of the most pressing issues facing our planet, and holding people in power to account. This podcast is edited on Gadigal land. Today's guest on the newscast is journalist Emily Atkin, founder of Heated, a weekly newsletter providing news and analysis on the climate crisis. Previously, Atkin was on staff at the New Republic covering climate change. She joins us today to talk about the state of environmental and climate reporting with co-host Rachel Donald, and why she chose to leave her former employer to start her own operation. Atkin also shares her thoughts on reporting philosophy, weighing in on the debate on objectivity in journalism, what the role of a journalist is, and why trust is so important. The trend of newsrooms laying off or axing climate and environmental writers has added additional stress onto an occupation already contending with how to communicate these complex, scientific issues that overlap significantly with human rights. In this conversation, Donald and Atkin unpack what one could argue are double standards that climate and environmental journalists face, and why they say independent media is critical to circumventing these challenges.
I'm so thrilled to have you here because getting a better understanding of what's going on with our media and the media machine and its relationship to politics, and then what these kind of independent newsrooms and independent journalists can achieve and why they can achieve it out with these kind of like typical corporate structures, I think that's so critical to understanding the world today. So first of all, Emily, thank you so much for joining us on this Pixabay Newscast.
Thank you for having me.
So I think before we dive straight into all of that, tell us a little bit about how Heated came about, because it's enjoyed such phenomenal success and your reporting has just been like so critical at this sort of juncture in history.
Thank you so much. I think that Heated was really born out of a response to being, I guess, in the media machine for a long time, and not necessarily wasn't like, I came from Heated from the New Republic, which isn't quite your typical, that's not the Washington Post or New York Times or AP in terms of like media machine, huge media operation owned by Jeff Bezos, right? It's a smaller operation, but still owned by, at the time, Wynn McCormick, very wealthy guy, and then staff of maybe 20 or 30. And you are affected by those ins and outs, those cycles of media. You're competing with everybody. And so you have a similar mindset. And it was born Heated out of a desire to try to separate myself a bit from the media narratives that I thought were dominating about climate change, because I felt that while, yes, at the New Republic, I could explore some of these different narratives, particularly narratives about accountability sometimes, they were not narratives that I could follow 100% of the time, because I had to compete. And I had to compete by doing what everyone else was doing versus by doing something, trying something new. Trying something new is very risky in media and in mainstream media. And so I had to be willing to take that risk on my own and not with the broader organization.
And how was it even that you came to take that risk? Because, media is like, first of all, everybody's like, it's a dying breed. It's not something that has typically happened before. I mean, even it's sort of like been the past few years that journalists are kind of like stepping out, but only after trailblazers like you came along and showed that it was possible. I mean, it's really an extraordinary feat.
Most people thought that I was insane. I wasn't sure that I wasn't at the time. I think there are multiple factors that will drive a person to take a risk, because at the time, 2019, when I started Heated, Substack, newsletters, independent journalists, publications, particularly on Substack, that was not a thing. There were a few Substacks. And when I told people that I was thinking about doing this, people were like, "Are you sure that you want to do that? That seems like huge. How are you going to?" And they're like, "How are you going to get paid? You going to sell ads?" I'm like, "No, I'm going to sell subscriptions." They're like, "You think people are going to pay for it?" I'm like, I hope people are going to pay for it. But I had to believe in myself, because I felt like if I didn't, then nobody else would. But I also think that, to go back to your question about like, how do you even get to that point? I hate bashing mainstream media so much, but it got to a point where I felt like in mainstream media, in my last job at the New Republic, I was getting ideas shot down quite a bit, despite accumulating years on my beat, accumulating years on the climate change beat. More often than not, my editor was somebody who did not have as much experience with climate change as I did. And some outlets will have climate change desks, and they will have a climate editor who is experienced on the beat. I never really had that. I had it back when I started climate reporting at Think Progress. But since then, I didn't have it. I went to Sinclair Broadcast Group, and then I went to the New Republic. And I was never edited by anybody that had as much experience on the beat as I did. By the time that I decided to leave, I had been on the beat for 6 years, and I felt like I was really getting to a place where I understood what I was talking about, which is difficult to really believe that you know what you're talking about. I feel like so much of, particularly starting on a beat in journalism, is imposter syndrome.
Yeah.
And I was feeling confident in my ideas, but so many of them were getting shot down, and I was getting really frustrated. And I started to think to myself, maybe I don't have good ideas. Maybe my editors are correct about, and I should be doing what they suggest and not what I suggest. And then after a while, I was just like, I don't think that changing jobs is going to help this. I don't think that going to, like, if I get my dream job, quote unquote, that I used to think when I graduated journalism school at like NPR or something, or if I get to go work at the Atlantic or something, I feel like I'm still going to have this problem. I'm still going to be fighting with people to get to tell the stories that I really want to tell. And I just was, I guess, angry and audacious and young enough to be like, well, it. I'm just going to try it. And if it doesn't work, at least I will know that they were right, that my editors were right, and that my ideas weren't good, but I wanted to fail on my own terms.
I interviewed Dar Jamil on Planet Critical a couple of years ago, and he told me this idea around how like the beat journalist came to be, because he was fortunate enough to have dinner once with Howard Stein and Noam Chomsky. And they were like, oh yeah, it's quite deliberate actually, like moving journalists around in a newspaper so that they don't accumulate too much knowledge, essentially. Like, first of all, it was about cutting costs, but then this idea of like, it's part of what keeps the media machine running. And for mainstream media to have the relationships that it needs to the inside in order to get the scoops, there has to be an element of like give and take. And so this idea that not only are expert journalists, which are becoming more and more common, it's not just that they are being edited perhaps by editors who don't know as much, which I've had a huge amount of problem with as well dealing with mainstream media. But it's also that our stories, joining together the big picture, are not fitting into these narratives that keep mainstream media afloat, as you say, which is why independent journalism is so critical. So can we go into that a little bit? Like, what were the media narratives that you saw at that time and that you still see that are prevalent today? And how does your reporting differ to that?
Well, it was so interesting because I was working at a liberal publication. I was working at a journal of progressive opinion. And so I was coming from Sinclair Broadcast Group, which was decidedly not that. And I don't know of Sinclair, but it is notoriously a right-leaning organization. It is a massive media conglomerate in the US that owns most of the local TV stations, the majority of the local TV stations in the country. And
Right.
so what you do as a Sinclair reporter, because Sinclair owns hundreds of local TV stations, is that you produce national segments, television segments, and digital news media segments. And then you send those segments off to the local affiliates, and local affiliates will choose whether or not to run them. And sometimes they're mandated for everybody to run. So I was used to being there, and I was there because I thought that I had a great opportunity to do reporting for a lot of these audiences that trust their local news stations across the country. And I could bring climate change reporting to a conservative audience, which was a really, I thought, great opportunity that I didn't want to pass up. It wound up, I think, as a lot of people warned me, not a great fit. But I was excited to get some room to breathe at the New Republic after Sinclair, at a progressive news organization known for being progressive, that I could start saying some things a little more clearly, particularly about responsibility for climate change. I had to fight at Sinclair to get those sentences in that said climate change is caused by humans. I wasn't even going to try to talk about what humans were causing climate, who the humans were, the disparate responsibility among people and industry and politics. I wasn't going to get in with that. I was just trying to get human cause out to those audiences. So I'm excited when I go to the New Republic about getting to talk a bit more explicitly about polluters and about politics and climate delay and the reasons why we have a climate crisis. That was where I really was able to start talking about it's not just all humans cause climate change, but not all humans cause climate change equally. Let's start to break some of these narratives and climate change stories that this is something that's happening because we're all responsible for it. And let's focus in on the people that are really responsible. And I was able to do some of that sometimes. I was not able to do that all of the time because I think for my editors, it was like a shtick, like accountability felt like a shtick. It could get overdone. That was not a beat, right? And nobody ever said the word shtick to me. This is my interpretation of how often an accountability story would really get greenlit. They were looking for interesting takes on climate change, and sometimes they were accountability takes, maybe a third of the time. But then other times we're just doing different kinds of like, here's what Democrats should be doing, and which is great. It really taught me how to write reported opinion. It was a really good exercise for me, but I wanted to be doing accountability as a beat. And I didn't want to be fighting about whether or not we were being too activisty by calling out polluters when I really thought that was what journalism was supposed to be. I didn't consider it to be an activist move to be constantly calling out polluters for polluting.
Absolutely. I mean, journalism seems to have really lost its way. It seemed to tie its laces on the objectivity front and then totally trip over and fall flat on its face. Even this idea that journalists can maintain a sense of objectivity when reporting on a story, which goes totally contrary to all of the social science that we know around the fact that we all have cognitive biases, and even how we choose to report on a story or who we choose to speak to, the framing, all of these things go into how that story is then reported to the public under the guise of objectivity. I mean, I remember listening to a podcast during COP27, so coming up to just over a year ago. And there were some really famous journalists being interviewed, including sort of one of the lead Guardian environment reporters, who I really rate. They do great work. But they were saying like, well, no, of course I can be objective. It's my job to be objective so that the public has the information that they can then educate themselves about. And it's like, well, first of all, that's not true. But that aside, also, how can you look at the state of the world and the layers of corruption going into facilitating the polluters and the pollution and not want to take a side? Like, we're talking about the sixth mass extinction event. We're talking about the forced migration or displacement of billions of people around the world. We're talking about crop failure. We're talking about terrible, terrible injustices, the continuation of terrible injustices. It boggles my mind that anybody would die on the hill of objectivity at a time like this, honestly.
Well, I think that objectivity and trust are two principles that journalists get very passionate about, right? But trust is the most important currency you have as a journalist. And I think that we forget that. I think that sometimes in mainstream media, objectivity is prioritized over building trust with your reader base. And the reason I say that is because I think when you're overly, quote unquote, objective about the climate crisis, which translates, I think, in a lot of reporters and editors' minds to emotionless, to
two-siding it.
I don't care about what happens to the planet, then readers feel gaslit about what's happening. They feel like they can't trust you because you are not, as a storyteller, as a reporter, you don't actually care about whether or not their world gets screwed or not. It's the same reason, I've said this many times before, but it's the same reason why you wouldn't trust a reporter reporting on a war or on a genocide who wouldn't flat out say, this is a horrific, what I'm looking at, what I'm seeing, this war, these deaths playing out in front of me is horrific. And I will tell you that. You wouldn't trust a reporter covering the opioid crisis who looked at all these kids dying and didn't say, this is a problem. Right? And we don't consider that to be necessarily a breach of journalistic objectivity, but for some reason, we still consider it to be a breach of objectivity for the climate crisis. And to just flat out say to readers, what's happening is really bad. And we don't want this to happen anymore. So we have solutions-oriented reporting, but we're still objective in that we're looking at the facts objectively, but that doesn't mean we have no values. That doesn't mean we have no empathy for others. And if you don't have those, then how do you expect to build trust, which again is your number one currency? We're in a media environment that is very tenuous, that people are getting laid off, that the financials are really bad. You need to have your readers believe in your mission and believe in your journalists, or else you've got nothing. And it was very important to me to communicate that because I'm so passionate about journalism as a whole, as an institution, and as a real player and protector of democracy. And I know that trust is such a big factor in that.
Totally. I completely agree with you. It is astonishing to me how people can levy criticisms against the kind of reporting that we do, because it's not quote unquote objective, given that I firmly believe that somebody can make a better value judgment about whether or not to trust my reporting because my values are right there. And they can see... Go on.
I was just in the shower yesterday having shower thoughts, right? Intrusive shower thoughts. What should I do with my business and with Heated and everything? And I was like, it's been years since I've revamped my About page. The About page on Heated is still the About page that I wrote right before we launched in 2019, right? So it's been a while. I was like, I need to have a section that clearly states Heated's values. about like what our quote unquote biases are, like how we are approaching stories with what's our baseline, so that readers can come by and they can be like, is this the publication for me? Let me see, like, do my values align? Because I do think that obviously people are going to have different values, and they should find journalistic outlets that are written by people that they trust, that their values align. And I'm not going to be for everybody, because we have billions of people in the world with different outlooks. It's actually why I think that a lot of this more mainstream stuff is still really necessary and really good, because I think that people need multiple sources of information that approach stories from a different way, so that they can figure out who they trust, et cetera, and what approach they really like. But I was just thinking that clearly stating your values, like, we think the climate crisis is bad, all of our stories will recognize that it is not good. Like,
totally.
That'll be number
that's
one.
such a good idea. That is such a good idea. I'm going to pinch that for Planet Critical and put
Please,
like a values and bias. Yeah, everybody should. Or even like, here are the frames through which I see the world. So that when you're engaging with my reporting, you can like do a level of critical analysis that to pierce through those frames as well. And thus also like help me see my blind spots as a journalist. Like, get involved as a reader, like comment. I posted a thing recently about Biden's U-turn on the LNG proposals, on the LNG exports. And let's get into this, because I think like framing, biases, journalism, the media machine, this is all circling around this story right now. And the angle I took was that just before the New York Times gets access to like 3 undisclosed sources to say that Biden's going to put a pause on it, which is essentially testing the story. And then the White House a few days later releases their statement, and it's all framed around concern for the climate crisis. Never mind approving Willow, never mind the plans for all of these LNG exports and the LNG terminals and the pipelines. Never mind that. Now he's interested in the climate. Well, interestingly, just a couple of days before all of this, there was an energy consultant who did some analysis of data on the Energy Information Agency's website, showing that like it looks like shale gas production in the USA has peaked. And shale gas is like 81% of the total dry gas production. And so he was saying now is the worst time ever to be investing hundreds of millions in this LNG infrastructure. And so I wrote this piece doing that and being like, be careful of this framing of it's a win for nonviolent direct action, because there's lots of things that nonviolent direct action do, but like, let's not allow them to play us into believing that our democracy is functioning right now. And we can either like continue with the exact same tactics that haven't worked in this case because something else is going on, or continue to ask young people to put their bodies on the line when this thing doesn't work. So that was kind of the framing that I took. And then one of my readers who also does his own sort of Substack also commented like, hey, here's some information on this as well. Like, it's also because of the amount of gas that's going to be coming out of Qatar and everywhere else around the world. So like the market's just flooded. And so that's another reason to pull back. And it was like this really collaborative effort that can only happen because of like the ecosystem of like independent journalists building relationships essentially with their readership and inviting them to collaborate.
Yes, totally. I mean, and I saw your article. I read your article. I also read your reader's comment that directed you to more information, because I myself am putting together here's how I think to understand this Biden LNG decision. I'm trying to put together like a bunch of different ways to look at it. And I was not aware of that EIA information about shale gas production peaking. And I thought that was interesting. But I also thought that like, I really feel like there's a balance between it, because I feel like the direct action actually, I think from my understanding of it and my reporting on it, that it absolutely did play a role, because I think that based on the Biden administration's response and how they've been rolling out this announcement, they are very scared of climate voters, and they are really pushing this as like their climate amazing decision that they did. And that's to try to get votes. So that's like the angle that I'm taking. I'm like, you need to look at how the White House, Democrats, and environmental groups are playing this as an effort to manipulate you into voting for them. They're exaggerating the importance of it. Here is the actual importance of the decisions. Like most, approvals of these new facilities are paused, but like so many have already been approved and are under construction, and this doesn't affect any of those.
Yeah.
So we're going to see LNG capacity export in the U.S. double over the next 3 years, no matter what. This decision really affects, like, you'll see people say it affects like 16 projects that are in the pipeline. Only like 5 of those projects, I haven't completely fact checked my number on this, so like take that with a grain of salt. But only a handful of those projects actually have active permit applications with the DOE right now.
Emily has since published her article on her Substack where she digs more into this. She writes, there are at least 6 major proposed LNG export terminals affected by the pause. If the Biden administration had not issued this pause, these facilities would have sailed through the normal DOE approval process. Emily also writes, the Biden administration did not block the export of LNG to other countries, and the 8 existing LNG export terminals around the country will continue to operate, and none of the 10 new LNG export facilities that are already approved by the Department of Energy are affected by Biden's decision. With these approved and under construction facilities, the volume of U.S. LNG exported to other countries is expected to double by 2028.
So even CP2, this huge one that everyone is talking about how it's one of the ones that's paused. CP2 is not scheduled to come online until 2027. They have not even started the DOE permit approval process. So this is a temporary pause that could last a couple months. It could last until the election. And once Biden gets reelected, he very well could just say, pause is over.
Exactly.
You know? And so what concerns me most is not only the Republican spin, which is wild in its own way, and I'm taking apart that as well. It's the Democratic spin, it's the White House spin, it's the environmental group spin that this is such an important climate decision. And you're like, no, it's a political calculation.
Absolutely.
But I think calculation won't stay a calculation unless pressure continues.
Sure. And that's why a huge amount of direct action and public awareness is absolutely critical. I totally agree with you. I just think I am very wary of bolstering or overly bolstering this idea that we are listened to in our democracies as if even there's something at the core of these democracies that is infallible and perfect and better than any other system in the world. And actually we're all very lucky and yada, 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 yada. There's fundamentally the empire, which is at the heart of every, nation that identifies itself as a democracy. Those mechanisms, these polluting mechanisms, these corrupt mechanisms that you investigate, that I investigate, are dressed up as democratic. And a huge amount of gaslighting in the media really allows for that show to go on. But to overstate how do I put this? I'm very wary now of overstating what the citizenry can do within the acceptable model of protest, which has been allowed to kind of, roll out, has had certain wins. And I think that this is particularly on the nose, obviously, when considering the vast majority of humankind is against genocide and against an active genocide. And the leaders of democratic nations all around the world are ignoring the millions of people taking to the street, ignoring international court rulings, ignoring the United Nations on something that is so demonstrably evil and wrong that, of course, that is their attitude to climate as well. which is slightly more complex because it involves our energy mix and our economies and very complex systems in our relationship to nature. But it's all there, I think.
Totally understand what you're saying. My only, I guess, response is like, what is the other option other than to not keep protesting, to not keep putting pressure on? It's like you have two options. It's either you do nothing or you try to do something. You're completely right about our democratic systems are fucked up and they try to gaslight us into thinking that we have more power than we do. But I also don't think it serves any of our readers to tell them that they have no power, because they do. They do have power. They just have to figure out how best to use it. I don't think a decision like Biden's LNG pause is completely a demonstration of, look how you are so incredibly powerful that like 5 months of sustained protest can stop this. But it is a demonstration of there is something there that will move the needle a little bit. And you have to, and it's not enough. So there you go. And if you want to move the needle more, you have to do more. Obviously. Right. And I think that's what you're getting at, which is that like these nonviolent direct actions, like they're not accomplishing enough. Right. Like we need to push forward. And I think by telling the truth about what this decision actually is, that's how people will see that it's not enough. Right? By saying like, look, this is what the Biden administration is trying to spin this as like an amazing climate decision that's like a massive win for the climate. No, it isn't. You still had power here. Like the pressure and the sit-ins and all this direct action, it did move the needle somewhat. It didn't move it enough. That doesn't mean stop. That means like reevaluate. Right? And I don't know. I think that I've always been wary of like being like, oh, how do I give my readers hope that they can have power? And I'm like, well, it's not really my job to give them hope. It's my job to educate them about what's happening. And I hope that doing that maybe doesn't give them hope, but gives them the information they need to understand how to become powerful.
I think that is absolutely the role of a journalist, like empowerment as a collective act as well, or as in a collective embodiment as a state, which can then be translated into like little decentralized pockets of power, essentially, which is what we would want it to end up looking like again in the future, right? Because like, God forbid power ever becomes so bloated again in the future. But I think I completely agree with everything that you said, completely. And I think that nuance, like that daring to tell the truth, to provide people, like to say to people as well, like, I trust you enough. I trust you enough to know. I trust you enough to like be stable. I trust you enough to know what to do with this information that I'm giving you, rather than providing people with hopium. Because it did get like that particular decision. Yeah, have you heard that before? It's wild.
No, I've never heard that. I want to read you a unsubscribe note that I got the other day. That was, I thought, interesting. Like people will subscribe to the newsletter and then people will unsubscribe. And sometimes they'll give you a little reason why. And one of the reasons I got on January 20th was like disappointing, unnecessary bashing of the Democratic Party with the last headline. While many members of the party do in fact disappoint us, it's the Republican Party that deserves the vast majority of criticism. Terrible decision to bash the Democratic Party during such a critical election year. Here's what the story was. The story was, here's how much Democrats get paid to shill for fossil fuels. It was a story about documents that we had obtained showing the actual salaries that Democrats, registered Dems, former Democratic members of Congress, receive from the gas industry to promote gas.
God.
And I have some readers that don't like that we're putting that information out there because it's a critical election year and we have to protect Democrats. My role as a journalist, I want to respond to this person, but I won't because we're not right for each other, but is that my role is not to protect Democrats.
Yeah.
My role is to empower readers to make the Democratic Party that they want, to ensure that their political representatives are representing their interests. I'm not on their side. I'm on the reader's side. And I think there's a lot of people that think that truly being on the reader's side is protecting the party that's not Trump, that you actually have a chance of having a truly adversarial battle with. When on the last day of Trump's presidency in 2020, I wrote an article, like a little essay for Heated, that was just like about the feeling of saying goodbye to an administration full of enemies and saying hello to an administration full of adversaries, which is a completely different relationship.
Mm-hmm.
The relationship between press and the government is supposed to be adversarial. It is not supposed to be like a lovey-dovey, and you're not supposed to be getting everything that you want as citizens from your government. It just that's not how it works. But it's an adversary relationship in which sometimes there are victories for the people that are represented in the democracy. Whereas in the Trump administration, it was an enemy relationship. You could push and push and push and push the Trump administration and nothing would happen, right? And that was exhausting for 4 years as a climate change reporter, as a national climate change reporter in DC. It was heartbreaking every year for trying to tell people what they should do. I remember thinking of the Biden administration as like, not great, but like an opportunity to at least to have that sort of relationship. And I do see that relationship play out here, at least like pressure is possible, but man, I still see how much more effective and how much better it could be. So I'm not going to be like, well, this is better than Trump, so get on board.
Yeah. There has to be, we really have to start raising our standards, I think, as a citizenry on what politics is, what our relationship to politics, to economics, what do our economies do? What are they meant to serve? Are they really meant to funnel wealth up to the top? I mean, that's obviously what they are meant to do. But as a collective, could we not think of a better reason for their existence, a better way to organize our relationship with the natural world as well? Even I interviewed Laura Martin a couple of episodes back on this podcast, and she was warning against the conservancy push and how there's still this duality, this divorce between humankind and the natural world, as if we're still not human, as if you have to fence it off, often dispossess indigenous people of their lands that they are stewarding and are a critical keystone species within that ecosystem, just because we really struggle to understand our place. And I think that this is such an interesting idea, because 2024 is going to be a hell of a year. Elections everywhere. It's what it feels like, certainly in some really, really major political players in the world. And what is our place? What is our place as the United States or the United Kingdom? What is our place as a citizen, as an activist, as a journalist? What is our place as a human being within all of this? It's only when you really understand where you are and figure out what your role can be, much as using ecosystem science to understand how everything's connected, then you can then start to affect change in the direction that you want to go. But exactly as we're saying, this big conversation around journalism, nobody can push in any direction if they don't know where they are. Nobody. And that is what independent journalism, I think Heated, Mongol Bay, really, really bring to the table. Moving away from the kind of relationship with the governments, which is often not just adversarial, but often quite pally, maybe not lovey-dovey, but pretty damn pally, and offering different perspectives on where we are so that figure can figure out, right, well, here's where we got to go then.
Yeah, I think in my own journalistic career, I have had to realize that I need to take a more ecosystem-based approach to what I'm doing, because I came, at least into starting Heated, I came into it in a very individualistic way, thinking that my publication and my community is going to be the best. It is going to move the needle so in such a big direction, and it is not a success unless it has consistent, measurable impact on our democracy, right? That's actually not how like movements works. It's not movements work. It's not how ecosystems work. You cannot measure the effect of, sometimes you can, it's like very rare, but like that type of pressure that you put on yourself as an individual, even as like a small community, to move a issue that is so global in nature is actually not in line with nature. I've struggled with it because I'm like, well, what does that mean, that I can't have an impact, that my readers can't have an impact? It's like, no, they can. Actually, collective action and working together as an ecosystem is the only way, demonstrated way, to create change, to make the world that you want. But if you believe that the way to do it is to you and your small community have to do everything, you will inevitably fail.
Yeah.
So like, you just have to keep going. And so you have to figure out a way to keep going that is sustainable for you, because it is about the long game. And that's what I've had to realize. I think the biggest thing about journalism is that like, if I'm going to keep doing it, if I'm going to keep educating my readership for the long game, like I have to do it in a more sustainable way and a more sustainable pace, like, because otherwise I'll quit. And that's a guaranteed way to fail.
Yeah. Yeah. And there are so many forces at play that would have it that journalists like you quit. And I think what I'm really excited at this point of like seeing all these independent journalists, we're starting to link up very much like an organic ecosystem. And I think that's one of the beautiful things that sort of built into the Substack model, is that you can start by yourself and then people will come and find you and they will suggest other people to you and you will start to recommend each other. And like, you know, I think it's been over the past kind of like year that me as an individual, I have felt, oh, I'm not an individual in this anymore. And I'm backed by women, essentially female women journalists, women climate journalists who are absolutely leading the charge with their expertise and their reporting. Everyone from you to Amy Westervelt, amazing people who have sort of like handcrafted the art and like dared take a stand as well, I think, to be an expert as a journalist, which is something that kind of, and this harks back to an earlier part in our conversation, but was frowned upon as well. Like you're meant to just be this, I don't know, like a piece of technical equipment, like a tuning fork, essentially, to like get the best out of someone. Well, what if I don't want to get the best out of someone? What if I want to get the truth out of someone? How can I know the truth unless I know what I'm talking about? I mean, one of the recent episodes on this was with Hannah Ritchie on her book, Not the End of the World. And she's been interviewed by everybody, like from the New York Times to the Guardian in the UK. And our interview was the only critical one. They dared engage and go, but this isn't right. And that's actually not quite correct. And that seems like a bit of an obfuscation. And also, how do you pick your data? That was one question that like listeners were like, yeah, thank you. Finally, somebody for asking this, because all of the other interviews were presented as this kind of like, oh, she's this objective data scientist, so we can take what she says as fundamentally true. And it's like, well, absolutely not, if you know the other bits of data that she's not presenting. And I think journalism has done itself a massive disservice by not allowing its own reporters to educate themselves and to dare like look at the world with expertise and say, I have an opinion on this because I know about it.
And to treat it as a competition, right? I think one of the things that you were just saying about the community and partnership that you feel with other independent journalists has been critical to your success. And particularly in this space. And I dipped my toe in political journalism for a while here in DC. And while it's nowhere like House of Cards, I would say that the environment in between journalists is more competitive. It's more viewing your fellow journalist also as an adversary, in addition to viewing the government as an adversary, and that you are on your own to like win the game of journalism, which was not how I envisioned it at all. one of the big reasons I decided to go back into climate change journalism after dipping my toe in political journalism was because of exactly what you were talking about. The camaraderie in between climate journalists and environmental journalists, and particularly those who are doing it on their own and feeling supported, like we're working together in this with the same goal, the same purpose, which is to create informed citizenries out of our communities. And so, like, I can't tell you how many times I've passed on a story that I don't have time to do to another climate journalist, or how many times I'll just message a climate journalist and be like, that source that you interviewed, you quoted in your story, I would love to talk to them. Can you give me their contact? And it's like, of course. We meet up at the annual Society for Environmental Journalists conference, and we genuinely like each other. We genuinely want to help each other. And that's also, I think, like a nature-based ecosystem way of doing journalism, is like understanding that other journalists are not your competition. You are working together to have the same goal. I'm going to this year's SEJ conference, the Society of Environmental Journalists conference, and I'm helping Amy Westervelt, who you just talked about, and Emily Holden, who's the editor of Floodlight News, which is a climate accountability publication. They're putting on like a 2-day climate change disinformation workshop for journalists to like teach other journalists how to report on climate disinformation, the history of disinformation. And I'm like so thrilled for that kind of opportunity. It's not something that is going to, teaching other journalists how to report on climate disinformation isn't something that's going to like measurably move the needle on policy. I'm probably never going to be able to trace that workshop to like a policy change in the United States. But it does mean that maybe another journalist one day will be able to do like a big climate disinformation story that turns on 10 people to be like, you know what, I'm going to do more climate activism. And that's how we make impact in that immeasurable way. And that's why we keep doing it.
That's the ecosystem, baby. That's it at work. Listen, I'm with you. Yeah, let's dance it out. Emily, I'm conscious of the time. So listen, thank you so much. Thank you so much for your work. Thank you so much for your inspiration. Thank you so much for your time today. It's been wonderful speaking with you.
Thank you so much. It's been great speaking with you too.
Yeah. Where do you want to start with this conversation? What do you want to reflect on first?
Maybe something that's important is acknowledging the fact that we didn't do a whole lot of talking about nature in this podcast, and it is a Manga Bay podcast. But I think that the reflections that we did on the importance of independent journalism and the ecosystem of independent journalism is really key, because I think it's been a lack of independent journalism and a lack of that kind of diverse set of perspectives that is part of the reason why the world is in crisis, essentially.
That is such an interesting insight, Rachel, because that was actually the thing I was going to talk about, was the importance of independent journalism. Sorry not to sound so obvious, but yeah, I totally agree. There's such an interesting conversation around the role of a journalist in our public discourse, and I think that sometimes that conversation, not this one you had with Emily, of course, but the conversation can get a little muddied. People can get confused about what actually is a journalist doing? What is their job and what are they doing? And I think that it's actually relatively simple what the job of a journalist is. I personally subscribe to the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, and I think they're pretty straightforward and easy to follow. And so I actually pulled them up for this conversation with you here. And they're really short, so it's not going to take too long. First one is seek the truth and report it, minimize harm, act independently, be accountable and transparent. Now, of course, on this, you can look this up online. There's like lots of guidelines below what each of these are that explain more of it, but they all come back to the same thing. And I think it's interesting that nowhere in the ethics is the word objective used. And I don't want to open a can of worms here, but I often think that term is sometimes used to justify reporting that is not contextualized or devoid of very important context. And I think it's important to acknowledge what objectivity isn't. And there's many instances of reporting where people are like, well, I'm just asking questions. It's like, well, you're not just asking questions. You're asking questions within an important context. And it is important to tell that context to the reader. And that is really hard to do and time consuming. And I think that a lot of people sometimes fail to remember that is what this is all about. So that was something I just wanted to highlight.
Thank you so much for that. I didn't know that was the code of ethics, and I love it. It sounds correct to my ears. The objectivity thing, I've got so many thoughts on this. So a few years ago, when I thought maybe I wanted to be an academic, I joined the staff at a university in London and was a lecturer there in journalism theory. And essentially what that meant is I got to sit in on my colleagues' courses, and I got this like crash course in journalism theory. And I got to learn all about the roots of objectivity. And what's amazing is that the consensus within academia has been clear for about 20 years. There is no such thing as objectivity in journalism. Everyone comes to a story with a bias or a perspective. How they choose to frame that story reveals their bias. Who they choose to interview for that story reveals their bias. What quotes they choose for the article out of the 1 hour long interview reveals their bias. Like, it's just not possible. The academic literature is so clear on it, and also clear that this kind of lie about the objectivity of journalism is quite harmful to the industry. And yet, if you go and speak to the vast majority of journalists, especially in mainstream media, that is the hill that they will die on. So as an industry, we're about 20 years behind the literature, which is only really suggesting what everyone else is suggesting in psychology or sociology, et cetera, et cetera. And it's quite funny if you think about the amount of journalists that will be reporting on things such as like cognitive biases or critical race theory, or how these are advancing like the social conversation, especially in countries like the United States, and yet not applying their own framework to the work that they're doing, for example. So it's just not possible in the way that I think the public is led to believe. And through that, generally speaking, it is not only doing journalism a disservice, but it's doing the public discourse a disservice, because as you said, it means that stories are often decontextualized or they're two-sided. People get somebody from the other side of the quote-unquote debate to quote-unquote balance the reporting. And when it comes to something like, I don't know, the climate crisis, you are creating a false narrative there by even suggesting that it's open to debate.
Yeah, so I think this is the thing that, as you have just said, that a lot of people are missing, and I think is sort of a media literacy issue. I hope I can say that without sounding condescending to people who are listening here. But the idea that you can present two ideas as if they are equal and opposing, I just don't think that fundamentally is reality necessarily. And no situation is going to be crystal clear, black and white. It's just not how it goes. If you're to present an interview where there are two scientists and one denies the impact of humans on climate change and the other doesn't, that is not an objective interview, because the vast majority of the scientific evidence out there points to humans influencing climate change. So it is not objective. Yeah. And just like I said, quote unquote, just asking questions that are devoid of context is going to distort how that interview is perceived, right? And so people aren't getting the entire narrative that occurs, and they don't have the information to examine the responses to those questions. That's not quote unquote objective either. And so this is something that's often not communicated because it takes a long time to explain what you and I just went over, but it's really important. And I also think that it is impossible for human beings to not have a point of view or a lens through which we view things. That's life. We all have our own experiences. We all come to something with a different perspective. It's whether or not we're allowing that perspective to distort the truth is when it's a problem, right? That's like where journalism ethics comes in. Like, you don't distort context. You don't distort facts. You still report on them, no matter how inconvenient it may be, or whether or not you don't like it, doesn't matter. That's the facts. That's the truth. You can be a human being and still do fair and accurate reporting.
Totally. I mean, not to get all like sciencey on us, but according to quantum physics, particles change when they are being observed. They react to being observed. So there is a suggestion that like who is looking at a thing or looking at a thing does like impact what that thing is. Like we are all in relationship with the world all the time. And like the relationship will have an impact on how you see things, and how you see things will then have an impact on like what those things are to you. And I think it's a journalist's job to be really transparent and honest about the frames that you are using when reporting, because then it will allow people to more accurately engage with your argumentation, with your analysis, with your stories, and also be able to see your blind spots, which will inevitably exist because we are, as a species, like programmed to find things that evidence what we already believe. And so a journalist is as culpable as anybody else of falling into that trap. And I think that's why having like a reciprocal relationship with your audience, where it's not that you are expert and they are novices, not like this teacher-student relationship, but rather one of like citizens engaged in the same democratic process of learning information about the world around them, then, I mean, the fact that my audience can like call me out or help me or email me and say, hey, you missed this or this would be helpful or whatever. I just think that's overall a net positive to whatever it is we're all doing, this thing called journalism.
That's so interesting, Rachel, because everything you just said, that's like right in the Society of Professional Journalists Code of Ethics, like responding to criticism fairly, identifying your sources, disclosing conflicts of interest. These are all things that you do in transparency and being fair. And like, that's not being biased. That's being a good journalist. So yeah, everything you just said is all in there. So I encourage people to check that out.
There's one thing I've been thinking about quite a lot since interviewing Emily, and it's this idea that this layer of quote unquote objectivity, this belief that a lot of journalists and the public buy into, it also serves to totally disconnect people performing the role of journalists from their other role as citizen, right? It's as if journalists are apart. It's as if they're up in the press galley and not down in the audience with the rest of us, with everybody else. It's as if whilst you were a journalist, you cannot also be a citizen, or citizens cannot also be journalists. And I think it's quite a deliberate tool of like divide and conquer in order to ensure that only a certain parts of information are being broadcasted to the public. Because if I'm a citizen of a town, for example, and that town is suffering from massively polluted waterways because of industrial agriculture runoff, because a company isn't taking care of, like, isn't fulfilling their obligation to the natural environment, all of these things, and I'm reporting on that story, I'm going to be emotionally invested in that story as well. And I should be emotionally invested in that story. I'm a citizen of that place, and that is impacting me. That is part of politics. And I think that the emotional investment in that story, maybe it means I will spend more time on the story. Maybe it means that I will, dedicate myself more to it. But it also means that I'm going to be involved in like every possible bit of like the democratic process around that. And to me, this idea that citizens suddenly denude themselves of all forms of citizenship in order to be objective reporters of a situation, it's not only totally false, but it's actually quite dangerous. And I think it absolves journalism of quite a lot of like responsibility, and also erodes the natural power that you have being a citizen in a democracy.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I would have to add to that is that being a journalist is a public service job. Your role is to be a watchdog, as it were, to the entities that the public needs to be held accountable. So I would hope that people would be invested in making sure that institutions are accountable for what they say and what they do. Journalism is the lever we have to spotlight that.
Yeah. I just think it's wild how we're living in an age where you're seeing people getting taken off of stories, or not being allowed to report on certain things, or being removed from the spotlight because of their potential like emotional involvement to a situation. And it's like, my God, the people who are emotionally involved, who are being impacted, they have the right to tell their story. journalist or not. And surely as a journalist, the story that you're going to hear from them is something so much more profoundly human and then real than just some average nonsense, quote unquote, objective stenography of the facts. I mean, that's my perspective.
Yeah. I think that if there's any serious environmental journalist out there, I doubt they haven't been emotionally impacted by the work they've done at some point. It's not easy to continually report on environmental destruction or breaching of human rights. It's hard. It's not easy to do that.
Yeah. And I think we would almost do like a disservice to our wider community. And when I say that, every human and non-human thing on the planet, if it wasn't emotionally impactful. And it's that emotional investment in what we're doing and like the positive stories as well. When you report on stories of communities that are thriving, or when you report on species that have come back from the brink, like those are just as important as well as any of the other kinds of stories that we report on of the destruction. And it's those moments of good news as well that really put like a spring in your step and make it possible to keep reporting on all the bad stuff as well.
Absolutely. Well, I think that's a pretty good note to land this conversation on.
Yeah, I think so too. Thanks, Mike. Always a pleasure. Yeah. Likewise.
If you'd like to read more on Atkin's work or Heated, please find more information by clicking on the links in the show notes. As always, if you're enjoying the Mongabay newscast or any of our podcast content like our sister series Mongabay Explores, and you want to help us out, we encourage you to spread the word about the work we're doing by telling a friend. Word of mouth is still the best way to help expand our reach, but as always, you can support us by becoming a monthly sponsor via our Patreon page at patreon.com/Mongabay. Mongabay is a nonprofit news outlet, and even just $1 per month does make a difference and helps us offset production costs. So if you're a fan of our audio reports from Nature's Frontline, head to patreon.com/Mongabay to learn more and support the Mongabay newscast and all of our podcast content. You and your friends can join the listeners who have downloaded the Mongabay newscast well over 500,000 times by subscribing to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts from, or you can download our app for Apple and Android devices. Just search either app store for the Mongabay newscast app to gain fingertip access to new shows and all of our previous episodes. And as always, you can read our news and inspiration from Nature's Frontline at mongabay.com, or you can follow us on social media. Find Mongabay via our accounts on LinkedIn at Mongabay News, and on Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky, Mastodon, Facebook, and TikTok, where our handle is at Mongabay, or on YouTube at Mongabay TV. As always, thank you for listening.